Some people can recognize the sound of money before they ever see it. Vivian Holloway said it with a smile as soft jazz drifted through the glass pavilion of the Holloway Motor Gala, and nearly everyone around her laughed like they'd been waiting for permission. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. Cameras flashed beside velvet ropes. 42 collector cars sat beneath white spotlights like museum pieces worth more than most homes in California. A silver Ferrari 250 GT occupied the center platform beneath a rotating display light, while investors in tailored suits moved slowly around it, holding champagne glasses that cost more than monthly car payments. Then the sound ruined everything. A rough metallic rattle echoed from outside the entrance. Heads turned immediately. The noise grew louder as an old rusted fastback rolled toward the valet lane, trailing a low cough from the exhaust pipe. It looked wildly out of place among the Bentleys and Ferraris parked beneath the glowing entrance canopy. The paint had once been dark blue maybe 30 years earlier, but now most of it had faded into uneven patches of dull steel and oxidation. One headlight sat slightly crooked. The hood carried scratches deep enough to catch light. A valet attendant physically stepped back as the car came to a stop beside a brand-new Rolls-Royce Phantom. The driver killed the engine and silence settled over the entrance for exactly 1 second before the whispering began. Caleb Mercer stepped out wearing faded jeans, worn work boots, and a charcoal jacket that looked older than some of the interns inside the gala. He didn't look embarrassed. That almost made it worse. He simply walked around to the passenger side and opened the door for the little girl inside. Sophie Mercer climbed out carefully, holding a paperback coloring book against her chest. Her blonde hair was tied into a loose ponytail, and she stared quietly at the enormous building in front of her while people nearby openly watched them. One man near the entrance smirked into his phone camera. "No way this dude thought this was valet parking," he muttered. Several people laughed. Vivian noticed the commotion. Immediately from halfway across the lobby, her black evening dress caught the chandelier light as she approached the entrance with the controlled confidence of someone used to rooms moving around her. At 32, she had spent 5 years turning Holloway Motors into one of the fastest-growing luxury automotive brands in the country, and tonight mattered. Investors from Chicago, Miami, and Tokyo had flown in for the launch of her company's new hypercar platform. Every detail had been curated down to the music and scent in the room. Then Caleb Mercer arrived sounding like a lawnmower with loose bolts. Vivian stopped near the valet line and looked directly at the rusted fastback. Her expression tightened slightly before she smiled again, this time colder. "Some people confuse nostalgia with garbage," she said casually, loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. The laughter came immediately. Even the valet attendants lowered their heads, trying not to grin. Sophie looked down at her shoes. Caleb remained still beside the old car with one hand resting quietly on the roof. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't try to explain why he was there. That silence somehow irritated Vivian more than if he had snapped back. One of the investors near the staircase chuckled and raised his glass toward Caleb's car. "Buddy," he called out, "I think the junkyard's about 3 exits north." More laughter followed. Sophie shifted closer to her father and wrapped her fingers around his hand. Caleb looked down at her for a brief second before calmly reaching into the car for an old folded cloth resting on the dashboard. Then, in front of everyone watching, he began gently wiping dust from the hood, like the car mattered more than the humiliation surrounding it. That was the moment an older Japanese investor near the Ferrari platform stopped smiling entirely. His eyes narrowed slightly as he stared at the shape of the fastback beneath the damaged paint. And for the first time that evening, someone important stopped looking at Vivian Holloway and started looking at Caleb Mercer's car. The room had changed without most people realizing it yet. 1 minute the crowd had been laughing at the old fastback parked beneath the glowing entrance canopy, and the next minute several collectors had quietly stopped talking altogether. Hiroshi Takeda stood near the marble staircase with one hand wrapped around a crystal glass untouched for nearly 10 minutes, while his eyes remained fixed on Caleb Mercer's car. At 68 years old, Takeda had spent 4 decades buying and restoring rare European race cars for private museums across the world. He had seen prototypes hidden in barns outside Milan, forgotten Ferraris abandoned in desert garages, and factory test vehicles buried beneath false identities after failed negotiations between manufacturers. Experience had taught him something simple. Truly valuable things almost never announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they arrived covered in dust while everyone important laughed at them. Vivian Holloway noticed the shift immediately. She was too sharp not to. Attention was moving away from her centerpiece display and toward the rusted fastback sitting near valet parking like a stain on an expensive shirt. She glanced toward Takeda and forced a polite smile. "Mr. Takeda," she said smoothly as she approached him, "I promise the real collection is inside." Takeda barely looked at her. His eyes remained on the fastback. "What year did he say it was?" Vivian blinked once. "I did not ask." That answer seemed to bother him more than the condition of the car itself. Across the valet lane, Caleb continued wiping dust from the hood with slow, careful movements while Sophie stood beside him quietly, holding her coloring book against her jacket. The little girl looked cold beneath the evening breeze rolling through the open driveway, but she never complained. A pair of younger investors nearby were still laughing under their breath while recording the scene on their phones. "This is unbelievable," one of them muttered. Guy rolled up to a 9-figure gala looking like he fixes lawn sprinklers. Caleb ignored them completely. That silence continued unsettling people in ways they did not fully understand. Most men became defensive when embarrassed publicly. Caleb Mercer simply looked tired. Not weak. Not intimidated. Just tired in the way people looked after carrying responsibilities too long without help. Vivian folded her arms. "Sir," she said toward Caleb with practiced politeness sharpened by irritation. "This is a private event for invited guests and registered collectors." Caleb finally looked at her directly for the first time that evening. His eyes were calm and strangely unreadable. "I was invited." Vivian gave a faint smile. "By who?" Before Caleb could answer, Sophie tugged lightly at his sleeve. "Dad?" she whispered softly. "Maybe we should go." Caleb crouched slightly so he could look at her face level. "Not yet, sophomore." His voice carried no frustration, no embarrassment, just certainty. Takeda slowly stepped away from the staircase. Several nearby guests noticed immediately and turned their attention toward him. Men like Hiroshi Takeda did not move casually around cars. If he walked toward a vehicle, people assumed there was a reason. Vivian noticed the crowd subtly shifting behind him, and her jaw tightened almost invisibly. Takeda stopped 3 feet from the rusted fastback and studied the front quarter panel in silence. His eyes traveled slowly across the body lines, the wheelbase, the hood proportions. Then he leaned slightly closer near the windshield edge where faded paint had chipped away beneath years of wear. Caleb watched him quietly. Takeda finally spoke without looking away from the car. "This body shape is wrong." One of the younger investors laughed. "Wrong as in ugly?" Takeda ignored him entirely. He pointed toward the lower frame beneath the passenger door. No American shop in the 1960s welded reinforcement joints like that. The laughter nearby faded almost instantly. Vivian crossed her arms tighter. "It is an old rust bucket, Mr. Takeda." Takeda finally turned toward her. "No," he said quietly. "It is pretending to be one." The laughter near the valet lane disappeared completely after Hiroshi Takeda spoke those 6 words. "It is pretending to be one." The sentence settled over the entrance like a shift in weather. Several collectors who had ignored the old fastback moments earlier now moved closer with slow, deliberate curiosity. Phones lowered. Conversations stalled. Even the jazz music drifting through the pavilion suddenly felt distant beneath the growing tension around the car. Vivian Holloway maintained her composed expression, but irritation had begun hardening beneath it. This evening had been designed around control. Every camera angle, every guest list, every vehicle placement had been orchestrated for one purpose. Holloway Motors was announcing itself as the future of luxury performance engineering. Instead, nearly 30 people were now gathered around a rusted car that looked ready for a scrapyard. Vivian stepped closer toward Caleb. "If this is some kind of stunt," she said quietly enough that only the nearest guests could hear, "you picked the wrong event." Caleb folded the old cloth carefully and rested it across the hood before answering. "I did not come here for attention." Vivian glanced toward the crowd gathering around them. "You have it anyway." Caleb did not respond. That silence continued to bother her more every minute. Takeda slowly crouched near the front wheel well while studying the lower frame. His fingertips hovered near the metal without touching it. "Interesting," he murmured. A younger collector wearing a navy tuxedo leaned closer. "What are you seeing?" Takeda pointed toward the underbody near the suspension mount. Hand-forged reinforcement. Not factory American work. Another man frowned. Could it have been modified later? Takeda shook his head slowly. Too old. Too precise. Vivian exhaled through her nose. Gentlemen, she said with restrained patience, you are discussing a rusted fastback like it belongs at Pebble Beach. Takeda finally stood upright again. Miss Holloway, he said calmly, sometimes the rarest things survive by looking worthless. That line hit the crowd harder than anyone expected. A few people exchanged uncertain looks. The atmosphere had shifted fully now. Nobody was laughing anymore. Sophie looked up at her father quietly while holding his hand with both of hers. Dad? She whispered softly, why do they care now? Caleb looked down at her and gave the faintest smile. Because somebody important noticed. Vivian heard the answer. Something about it irritated her instantly because it sounded true. One of her lead engineers, Marcus Hale, finally pushed through the growing crowd carrying a tablet under one arm. Marcus was 39, respected throughout the industry, and rarely impressed by anything older than 10 years. He glanced once at the rusted car and smirked. This is what stopped the gala, he asked. Takeda looked toward him. Open the hood. Marcus laughed lightly. You cannot be serious. Takeda never changed expression. Open it. Vivian folded her arms. Fine, she said. Let us get this over with. Marcus stepped toward the front of the car and reached for the hood latch beneath the grill. Caleb's voice stopped him before he touched it. Careful. Marcus looked over his shoulder with a faint grin. Why? Is it fragile? Caleb met his eyes calmly. No, it is valuable. Several people in the crowd exchanged glances at that answer. Marcus rolled his eyes slightly and released the latch. The hood opened halfway before catching. He frowned. It is jammed. Caleb stepped forward quietly. For the first time all evening the crowd moved aside for him without being asked. He rested one hand against the hood near the left edge and pressed gently against a specific spot hidden beneath the rusted metal. A soft mechanical click answered immediately. Marcus looked surprised before stepping back. Caleb lifted the hood slowly. The crowd leaned forward together almost instinctively. For a brief second, nobody spoke at all. Then Marcus Hale's expression changed completely. The smirk vanished from his face so quickly it looked like someone had erased it. Marcus Hale stared into the engine bay without speaking for nearly 5 full seconds. Around him the crowd leaned closer, trying to understand what had suddenly drained the color from one of Holloway Motors' top engineers. The inside of the fastback did not match the outside at all. Beneath the weathered hood sat an engine layout unlike anything expected inside a forgotten American project car. Hand-built intake runners curved through the center with unusual symmetry. The metal surfaces carried years of age, but almost no corrosion. Every weld line looked deliberate, precise, personal. Marcus slowly reached one hand toward the engine before stopping halfway, like he suddenly was not sure he had the right to touch it. That is impossible, he muttered quietly. Vivian stepped closer beside him. What exactly are we looking at? Marcus swallowed once before answering. Not a stock engine. Takeda gave a faint, humorless smile. Obviously, Marcus ignored the comment. His eyes remained fixed deep inside the engine bay. This block geometry should not exist in this chassis. Several guests exchanged confused looks. One investor frowned. Speak English. Marcus pointed carefully toward the center housing. This was custom fabricated by hand. Probably overseas. Vivian crossed her arms tighter. People modify old cars every day. Marcus shook his head immediately. Not like this. The crowd had grown larger now. Guests from inside the gala were quietly drifting toward the valet lane after hearing whispers move through the building. Some still held champagne glasses. Others carried phones lowered at their sides, no longer recording for comedy, but for something closer to disbelief. Sophie stayed near her father, while Caleb stood calmly beside the open hood, without trying to explain anything. That silence continued changing the room around him. A younger collector finally spoke up. How much would something like this even cost? Marcus answered without looking away from the engine. Today? Millions. The words hit the crowd instantly. Several people who had mocked the car earlier went completely quiet. Vivian's expression hardened. You are telling me this rusted shell contains a multi-million-dollar engine? Marcus exhaled slowly. I am telling you somebody spent extraordinary money and skill building this. Takeda stepped forward again. This time he pointed toward a narrow section near the rear firewall hidden beneath old wiring. There, he said softly. Marcus leaned closer immediately. His eyes narrowed. No way. Vivian moved beside them impatiently. What? Marcus looked at Caleb for the first time with genuine uncertainty. Can I remove this panel? Caleb studied him briefly before nodding once. Marcus carefully loosened two small fasteners near the back edge of the engine housing. The metal plate lifted slowly with a faint scrape. Dust drifted lightly beneath the valet lights. Then the entire atmosphere changed again. Takeda inhaled sharply. One older collector actually removed his glasses to stare more closely. Marcus froze completely while holding the panel in his hands. Vivian stepped forward beside them and finally saw it herself. Beneath the hidden plate sat a faded line of red handwriting across brushed aluminum almost invisible beneath decades of wear. Not printed, not engraved by machine, written by hand. The signature curved sharply across the metal in old Italian script. Enzo Ferrari. Nobody spoke. Not one person. The entire valet lane fell into complete silence beneath the distant music from inside the gala. Vivian stared at the writing like her brain refused to process what her eyes were seeing. Marcus finally whispered the words nobody else seemed capable of saying out loud. That cannot be authentic. Takeda never looked away from the signature. It is. One of the investors laughed nervously. Hold on. You are saying Enzo Ferrari personally signed an American fastback? Takeda answered quietly. No, he looked slowly toward Caleb Mercer. I am saying this car was never truly American to begin with. The silence around the valet lane stretched long enough for people to become uncomfortable inside it. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody even lifted their phones. The signature hidden beneath the old panel had changed the atmosphere completely. A rusted fastback that had been treated like garbage 15 minutes earlier now sat beneath the entrance lights like a buried artifact nobody fully understood. Vivian Holloway stared at the faded red handwriting while her thoughts moved faster than her expression allowed anyone to see. She had spent most of her adult life inside elite automotive circles. She knew exactly what the name Enzo Ferrari meant to collectors. Entire museums had been built around less significant discoveries than this. Yet the man standing beside the car still looked like someone who repaired farm equipment in a small-town garage. That contradiction bothered her deeply. Marcus Hale carefully lowered the panel back into place like he was handling something fragile inside a church. Do you understand what this could be? He asked quietly toward Caleb. Caleb shrugged once. A car. Several collectors exchanged glances at that answer. Takeda almost smiled for the first time all evening. Interesting man, he murmured softly. Vivian stepped closer toward Caleb. Her tone remained controlled, but the edge inside it had changed. The arrogance was fading now, replaced by calculation. Where did you get this vehicle? Caleb rested one hand lightly against the roof. My father left it to me. And he never explained what it was? Caleb looked toward the open hood before answering. He told me some people would eventually recognize it. Another silence followed that sentence. A younger investor spoke up nervously. Hold on. If this thing is real, why would somebody hide it inside a junk car? Takeda answered before Caleb could. Because hidden things survive longer. The crowd had doubled in size now. Guests continued filtering out from the gala floor after hearing rumors spread through the building. Several luxury dealers stood near the entrance whispering urgently among themselves. One older collector from Connecticut had already called his restoration manager twice in the last 5 minutes. The atmosphere no longer felt like a charity event. It felt like the early moments of a bidding war nobody was prepared for. Sophie looked up at her father quietly. Dad, she whispered. Are we in trouble? Caleb crouched slightly beside her. No, sophomore. Then why is everybody staring? Caleb brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear before answering. Because they finally slowed down enough to see something. Vivian heard every word. That bothered her more than she expected. Marcus leaned back toward the engine bay again, studying the handcrafted assembly with growing disbelief. This makes no sense, he said quietly. Ferrari never partnered with American manufacturers publicly during that period. Takeda nodded once. Publicly. Marcus looked toward him sharply. You think this was a private prototype? Takeda folded his hands behind his back. I think somebody tried to build something they were never supposed to build. The sentence moved through the crowd immediately. Curiosity deepened. Several guests stepped closer again. Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly. You are making assumptions based on a signature. Takeda turned toward her calmly. No, Miss Holloway. I am making assumptions based on craftsmanship. He pointed toward the engine housing. Every piece inside this car was built by someone obsessed with precision. Men like that do not waste effort on ordinary machines. Vivian crossed her arms tightly again, but this time it felt defensive rather than dominant. She hated losing control of rooms, especially her own. One of the investors near the staircase finally asked the question everybody had started wondering. What is it worth? Nobody answered immediately. Marcus looked toward Caleb first. Takeda looked toward the car itself. Vivian remained silent. Then an older collector near the back of the crowd spoke quietly without taking his eyes off the engine. If this is authentic, he said slowly, there are collectors in Europe who would pay anything to own it. Caleb finally closed the hood gently with both hands. The metallic click echoed softly beneath the entrance canopy. Then he looked directly at Vivian Holloway for the first time since the reveal. Good thing it is not for sale. The moment Caleb Mercer said the car was not for sale, the crowd reacted the way people always reacted when money suddenly lost its power. The silence deepened. Several collectors who had quietly prepared themselves to make offers now looked almost offended by the idea that somebody standing in worn work boots could casually refuse fortunes they would spend years chasing. Vivian Holloway studied Caleb carefully beneath the entrance lights. Earlier that evening, she had dismissed him with the confidence of someone used to categorizing people within seconds. Poor mechanic. Old car. Wrong crowd. Problem solved. But now every assumption she had made about him felt unstable. Worse, everyone around her knew it. A valet attendant near the curb whispered to another employee, "That guy turned down more money in 10 seconds than I will make in my whole life." The second attendant nodded without taking his eyes off Caleb's car. Marcus Hale stepped closer again with visible restraint, like a man trying not to sound desperate. "Mr. Mercer," he said carefully, "if this vehicle is authentic, historians will want documentation. Provenance. Build records." Caleb looked toward him calmly. "Already have them." That answer moved through the crowd instantly. Vivian's eyes narrowed. "You have paperwork?" Caleb nodded once. "Some." Takeda tilted his head slightly with renewed interest. "From Italy?" Caleb looked at him for a moment before answering. "From my father." The old collector's expression changed subtly at that sentence. Respect. Genuine respect. Vivian noticed it immediately and hated how much it mattered. One of the younger investors laughed nervously. "This keeps getting crazier." Another collector near the back stepped forward. "Your father worked with Ferrari?" Caleb rested one hand against the roof of the fastback. "No," he paused briefly. "He built engines for people who wanted to beat Ferrari." Several older guests exchanged quick looks at that answer. Marcus exhaled sharply beneath his breath. Takeda's eyes sharpened instantly. "Ford." Caleb said nothing. He did not need to. The implication landed hard enough on its own. Vivian finally understood why Takeda had reacted the way he did earlier. This was no random collector piece. If the story forming around the car proved real, then the vehicle sitting beneath her gala entrance represented something much larger than luxury. Rivalry. Ego. History. A hidden chapter from the most famous automotive war ever fought. The crowd continued growing denser around them. Even guests inside the ballroom had begun ignoring the official showcase vehicles entirely. Cameras now pointed toward Caleb's rusted fastback instead of the polished hypercars inside the pavilion. Vivian glanced toward the glass entrance where her marketing director stood frozen with visible panic. The gala she had spent 11 months planning was quietly being stolen by a single father with grease beneath his fingernails. Sophie tugged lightly on Caleb's sleeve again. "Dad," she whispered, "I am hungry." Caleb's expression softened immediately. "I know, sophomore." He reached into the car through the passenger window and handed her a small paper bag from the seat. Inside sat a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in foil and a juice box. The little girl smiled faintly before sitting on the curb beside the car, while collectors worth hundreds of millions of dollars continued staring at the vehicle like archaeologists surrounding buried treasure. Something about that image shifted the atmosphere again. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Caleb Mercer had arrived at a luxury gala carrying his daughter's dinner in a paper bag while standing beside a machine that could change automotive history. Vivian watched Sophie unwrap the sandwich carefully, and felt something uncomfortable settle in her chest. Shame. Not dramatic shame. Worse, quiet shame. The kind that arrived after realizing you laughed at someone before understanding who they were. Marcus looked toward Caleb once more. Why bring it here tonight? Caleb glanced toward the brightly lit ballroom beyond the glass doors. Because my wife wanted people to see it finished one day. That answer silenced the crowd all over again. Even the city noise beyond the valet lane suddenly felt far away. Vivian looked at the old fastback differently for the first time all evening. It no longer looked like rust. It looked like grief that somebody had spent years rebuilding by hand. For the first time that evening, nobody seemed interested in going back inside the gala. The $7 million concept car rotating beneath the ballroom lights had become background decoration, while nearly every important guest in attendance remained gathered around Caleb Mercer's rusted fastback beneath the valet canopy. The shift was complete now. Earlier people had laughed because the car looked poor. Now they stared because they were terrified it might be priceless. Vivian Holloway stood near the front fender watching the crowd. She had carefully curated slowly orbit around a man she had publicly humiliated less than an hour earlier. The loss of control unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She built companies by reading people quickly. Investors trusted her instincts because she almost never misjudged value. Tonight she had mistaken one for trash in front of half the automotive world. Marcus Hale looked toward Caleb again. You restored all this yourself? Caleb nodded once. Mostly. Marcus glanced back toward the engine bay with visible disbelief. That would have taken years. Caleb looked toward Sophie, sitting quietly on the curb, finishing her sandwich. It did. Takeda studied Caleb carefully now, no longer as a curiosity, but as a craftsman. Your wife helped restore it. Caleb's expression softened slightly. She handled the body work. Vivian listened without speaking. Something about the answer hit her unexpectedly hard. She looked again at the faded paint, the repaired trim, the tiny imperfections hidden across the car's surface. Earlier she had seen neglect. Now she saw fingerprints. Human ones. Late nights. Sacrifice. Patience. The car no longer looked ugly once she understood somebody had loved it enough to keep saving it piece by piece. A collector from Miami stepped forward carefully. Mr. Mercer, he said, if the documents you mentioned are legitimate, museums would fight over this. Caleb gave a small shrug. Maybe. The collector blinked. You do not seem excited by that. Caleb looked at the car for several seconds before answering. My daughter still needs braces. Excitement is expensive. The line landed harder than any speech could have. Several people lowered their eyes immediately. Vivian felt her stomach tighten. 15 minutes earlier, she had mocked this man's car while holding a glass of champagne that cost more than his daughter's dinner sitting in a paper bag beside the curb. Sophie looked up at her father suddenly. Mom liked the noisy engine best. Caleb smiled faintly. Yeah, she did. Marcus glanced toward Sophie. Your mother worked on this car too? Sophie nodded proudly. She painted the stripe herself. Marcus slowly ran his eyes along the faded dark blue line stretching across the side panel. Earlier it had looked uneven. Cheap. Now he realized the stripe had been hand-painted by someone who probably stood in a garage for hours trying to make an impossible dream look beautiful again. Takeda folded his hands behind his back. Do you know what collectors chase most aggressively? He asked quietly toward the crowd. Nobody answered. The old man looked toward the car. Stories. He pointed lightly toward the fastback. Machines become valuable when human beings leave pieces of themselves inside them. The valet lane fell quiet again after that. One by one, the people surrounding Caleb's car stopped behaving like investors calculating numbers and started behaving like witnesses standing near something personal. Vivian looked at Caleb differently now. Earlier, she saw a poor mechanic desperate for attention. Then she saw a hidden collector hiding a fortune beneath rust. But now she saw something else entirely. A husband who had spent years preserving the last shared dream he had built with his wife while raising a little girl alone. That realization hurt in a way she did not expect. A soft vibration interrupted the silence. Vivian looked down at her phone. Her marketing director had sent 6 messages in less than 2 minutes. Livestream clips from the valet lane were exploding online. Headlines had already started appearing across automotive blogs. Mystery Ferrari prototype discovered at Holloway Gala. Unknown collector shocks luxury event. Hidden Enzo signature found in rusted fastback. Vivian stared at the screen for several seconds before slowly locking the phone again. Then she looked back toward Caleb Mercer standing beside the old car with grease on his hands and his daughter at his side. And for the first time all evening, she realized the most important story at her own gala had never been inside the ballroom at all. The atmosphere beneath the valet canopy no longer resembled a luxury gala at all. It felt closer to the moment before an auction begins, when everyone in the room realizes something extraordinary has appeared unexpectedly and nobody wants to be the first person to admit how badly they want it. Conversations moved in hushed tones now. Collectors whispered into phones. Assistants hurried through the crowd carrying tablets. Somewhere inside the ballroom, a string quartet continued performing for guests who had mostly abandoned the event entirely. Vivian Holloway watched the entire shift happen in real time with a growing mixture of frustration and reluctant admiration. She had spent years learning how attention worked. Tonight, Caleb Mercer controlled an entire room simply by refusing to chase it. Marcus Hale finally broke the silence again. "Mr. Mercer," he said carefully, "there are only a handful of people in the world capable of restoring something like this correctly." Caleb looked toward the old fastback. "Then it is good we only needed one." Marcus almost smiled at that answer. Almost. Vivian studied Caleb quietly while Sophie leaned against the passenger door, holding her empty juice box. The little girl looked exhausted now, but she never complained once. That detail stayed with Vivian more than she expected. Most adults in this environment spent entire evenings demanding attention. Sophie Mercer had spent the night sitting on a curb while strangers argued about millions of dollars around her father's car. Takeda stepped closer toward Caleb again. "Your wife," he said softly. "She understood what this car was." Caleb nodded slowly. "Before I did." Vivian glanced toward him. "You did not recognize the signature?" Caleb shook his head once. "My father kept most of the original engine hidden in crates for years. Said people became dangerous around certain kinds of history." Takeda's expression darkened slightly with understanding. "Smart man." Caleb looked toward the skyline beyond the valet lane. "After he died, my wife spent almost 3 years helping me piece everything back together." Marcus frowned slightly. 3 years. Caleb nodded. "Nights mostly. After work." Vivian tried to picture it without meaning to. A quiet garage somewhere outside the city. 2 exhausted people rebuilding a machine nobody else understood while raising a little girl at the same time. Suddenly, the imperfections in the car no longer looked accidental. They looked earned. One collector near the back finally stepped forward holding a business card with visible urgency. "Mr. Mercer, if you ever reconsider selling, my firm represents clients in Monaco, Zurich, Abu Dhabi." Caleb gently raised one hand before the man finished. "I am not selling it." Another collector spoke immediately afterward. "At least allow us to authenticate it professionally." "Already did." The crowd reacted instantly again. Marcus blinked. "You had it verified?" Caleb reached into the inside pocket of his old charcoal jacket and removed a folded envelope worn soft at the edges from years of handling. He passed it quietly toward Takeda. The older collector opened it carefully while several people leaned closer, trying to glimpse the contents. Inside sat photographs, handwritten notes, engineering sketches, and one cream-colored document stamped with faded Italian markings. Takeda's eyes widened slowly as he read. "Good Lord," he whispered. Vivian stepped beside him before he could stop her. The paper carried signatures from automotive historians in Medina alongside authentication references tied to Ferrari archives dating back more than 50 years. Marcus stared at the documents with open disbelief. "Why did you never tell anyone?" Caleb looked genuinely confused by the question. Nobody asked. Several people actually laughed softly at that, not mockingly this time, but almost in disbelief at how simple the answer sounded. Vivian looked at Caleb differently again after that moment. Earlier, she saw a poor man embarrassing himself outside a luxury event. Then she saw a hidden collector standing on a fortune. Now she saw something much more unsettling. A man completely untouched by the need for approval. That kind of person was rare in rooms built entirely around status. Sophie tugged lightly on Caleb's sleeve again. "Dad." "Yes, off." She pointed toward the brightly lit ballroom behind the glass doors. "Mom would have liked the music in there." Caleb looked toward the ballroom for a long moment before answering quietly. "Yeah." Then Sophie asked the question that silenced everyone around them all over again. Do rich people only care about things after somebody famous touches them? No one answered Sophie's question immediately. The little girl stood beside the rusted fastback, holding her empty juice box while some of the wealthiest people in the automotive world struggled to say something honest in front of a 7-year-old child. The silence that followed felt heavier than every reaction before it. Vivian Holloway looked at Sophie, then at Caleb Mercer, and for the first time that evening, she stopped thinking like a chief executive officer protecting an event. She started thinking like a human being, realizing she had misjudged another human being in the worst possible way. Around them, the valet lane remained crowded with collectors, investors, engineers, and reporters quietly trying to process how the entire night had turned upside down. The official gala inside the ballroom had become irrelevant now. Nobody cared about launch speeches or luxury branding anymore. They cared about the old fastback sitting beneath the lights beside a single father who never once tried to impress anyone. Caleb finally answered his daughter softly. Sometimes. Sophie frowned slightly. That seems sad. Takeda lowered his eyes after hearing that. Marcus Hale rubbed one hand across the back of his neck, quietly, like a man suddenly embarrassed by his own industry. Vivian stared at the faded stripe running along the side of the car and remembered her own words from earlier. Some people confuse nostalgia with garbage. Hearing them now inside her own memory felt unbearable. One of the younger investors slowly slipped his phone back into his pocket. Another collector quietly walked away from the crowd entirely. The mood had changed again, but this time it was not about money or rarity. It was about perspective. Caleb reached down and picked up Sophie's paper bag from the curb before folding it neatly in his hand. "We should head home," he said gently. The crowd shifted immediately at those words. People who earlier laughed at him now looked strangely anxious, watching him prepare to leave. One collector stepped forward quickly. "Mr. Mercer, at least let us arrange secure transport for the vehicle." Caleb shook his head once. "It still drives." Marcus almost laughed softly at that. "That is honestly the most unbelievable part of tonight." Caleb opened the passenger door for Sophie carefully while the little girl climbed back into her seat, hugging her coloring book against her chest. Then he walked around toward the driver's side. Vivian moved before she fully thought about it. "Wait." Caleb paused beside the door and looked at her calmly. For a moment, Vivian Holloway seemed unsure how to stand inside her own skin. Confidence had never been difficult for her before. But apologies were different from presentations. There was no script for this kind of moment. The crowd watched silently. Vivian finally spoke. "I was wrong about you." Caleb held her gaze without answering. Vivian glanced briefly toward the car before continuing quietly. "And I was wrong about the car." Caleb looked toward the rusted fastback beneath the entrance lights. "Most people were." Vivian swallowed once. "Still, I should not have treated you the way I did." The honesty in her voice surprised even her own staff standing nearby. Caleb studied her for several seconds before nodding once. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just acknowledgement. Somehow that felt heavier than anger would have. Vivian looked toward Sophie inside the passenger seat. "Your mother did beautiful work on the stripe," she said softly. Sophie smiled for the first time all evening. "Dad says she painted it 3 times because she wanted it perfect." Vivian looked back toward Caleb. "Was it?" Caleb glanced at the stripe beneath the lights and gave the faintest smile. "No," he paused briefly. "That is why she loved it." The answer landed gently over the crowd like the final piece of a story finally finding its place. Caleb climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The old engine came alive with a deep, uneven growl that rolled across the valet lane and through the silent crowd surrounding the car. Nobody laughed at the sound this time. They listened to it. Caleb rested one hand on the steering wheel while Sophie waved shyly through the passenger window toward nobody in particular. Then the rusted fastback slowly pulled away from the gala entrance and disappeared into the city night, while dozens of luxury cars remained parked motionless beneath the lights behind it. Long after Caleb Mercer was gone, nobody inside the Holloway Motor Gala seemed capable of talking about anything else.